Good afternoon. Thank you guys for having me. And I'm going to give you a short history of the Buffalo Soldiers. You know, but the Buffalo Soldiers' history actually started in 1866. But before then, black soldiers served in the United States for many years. They fought in the Revolutionary War. They fought in the War of 1812. They fought in the Civil War. Over 170,000 black men fought for the Union Army in the Civil War. But they were not actually in the Army, because George Washington made a decision many years ago that black men could not enlist in the United States Army. So they always fought with some militia or from for some state or something of this nature. During that time, they were called the United States Army Colored Troops, and that's what they fought under. Well, after the Civil War, a lot of men decided that they wanted to go home. They didn't want to fight anymore. So they took discharges, they left the Army short. So in 1866, Congress decided that they were going to reorganize the United States Army. And they did by adding 10 regiments. Those regiments, 2 of them would be cavalry, and they would include black soldiers. 4 would be infantry, and they would be all black soldiers. But they had to have white commanders in order for them to be organized. Well, there were a lot of commanders said, we will never fight with a black man, because he ain't no good. He'll run, he won't fight. So they offered to Custer. Well, Custer said, no way, I ain't gonna do it. So they said, okay, well, you won't be a general anymore, you'll become a lieutenant colonel. So I guess that opened the eyes to a couple of guys. Benjamin Grierson was a colonel, and he said, I'll do it, because I fought with black soldiers during the Civil War, and all the things you're saying is not true. Edward Hatch said, I'll do it, because I feel the same way. So we're talking strictly about the cavalry. Benjamin Grierson took over as the commander of the 10th Cavalry, and he started to recruit soldiers. Edward Hatch took over the 9th Cavalry, and he started to recruit soldiers. Edward Hatch recruited out of Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, those states along that area, in that area. But Benjamin Grierson said, I want a higher caliber of soldiers. I want free men that's been freed. So he went into the Missouri Valley and recruited his men. Now, these men that he was recruiting, a number of them were right out of slavery. They could not read, they could not write. They had no idea, in a lot of cases, what they were getting themselves into. But there were veterans. They had been United States Army Colored Troops. And they were the ones that had to help train and get these men up to par. So down in Greenville, Louisiana, the 9th Cavalry was organized. The 10th was at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. A lot of you say, well, that's the home of the Buffalo Soldiers. Well, yes, it is. If you stop and think about it, Fort Leavenworth is where they have the statues of the Buffalo. That was the first place they really recognized Buffalo Soldiers was at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. So Benjamin Grierson actually started training his soldiers there. But the general in charge, the post commander at Fort Leavenworth, did not like black soldiers. So he put them in the worst part of Fort Leavenworth, down in the area where the water drained. It was always muddy. They didn't have decent amenities down there. And so Benjamin Grierson, he got angry. He raised all kind of, ATLL down there. And he finally wrote the Department of the Army explaining to them, so they moved that 10th Cavalry over to to Fort Riley, Kansas. And that's where he started training, and he got his men up to par. Now this was all in July of 1866. During that time, by September, those soldiers were ready to fight. They had been trained, they knew how to ride horses in a lot of cases. Those that did not learn how to ride a horse had to lead a horse. So while the other soldiers were riding, they were walking, pulling their horse behind them. They had to learn on the move. And that was some of the ways that they learned how to train. A number of them had never fired a weapon. So they had to be trained how to fire a weapon. Because in slavery, of course, they were not allowed to do that. The sergeants were the men that were able to read and write. They were the ones that were detailed to teach the other individuals how to do those things. We had black chaplains at that time. And most of them were educated. They had come out of the North. And they were also men that could teach the young soldier how to fight. At the end of the training, the Buffalo Soldier went out on different patrols in Kansas. And as they went out, they would go out to guard the men that were building the railroad, putting in the telegraph wires and things of this nature. One group of Buffalo Soldiers went out, and they weren't Buffalo Soldiers at the time, they were just black soldiers. I keep saying Buffalo Soldiers because that's what we ended up calling them. And a lot of people go, well, how did they get the name Buffalo Soldier? Well, the first time they went to the field, they were guarding some men that were putting out the telegraph wire. And there was about 60 of them in the regiment that went out. And they were guarding these men, and they were attacked by the Cheyenne. A force of over 300 Cheyennes attacked these 60 men. Those guys got into a square, and they fought their way back to civilization. And during that time, they fought so ferociously that the Cheyenne was surprised. They had never saw a black man that could fight that much. They had never saw a black man, period. And when they looked at him, they saw some of them, and by the hair on their head and the tenacity that they fought, they said, these men fight like buffalo. So, from that, legend says that that's how they got the name Buffalo Soldier. Can't nobody prove it, so we don't know who said it first. But the men decided that, hey, that sounds pretty good. And they accepted the name Buffalo Soldier. So at that point, it happened with the 10th Cavalry. Now every cavalry unit, every infantry unit that was black decided we all are Buffalo Soldiers. So that's basically the story, the legend of how the name Buffalo Soldier got started. So General Sheridan came, and he was on his winter expedition. He picked up him a crew of Buffalo Soldiers, a couple of regiments, and they went out further to the west. They went down into Texas. And he was just inspecting Army troops at that particular time. And his escorts, of course, were the Buffalo Soldiers. And on their way back, they came up through Burkburnett, right on up to the Wichita Falls area. And they stopped out in the Wichita Mountain. When he got there, he decided, man, this is a good place to have a fort. Maybe we'll decide to put a fort here. And they stopped up in the mountains, and it was kind of hilly out there because they were in the Wichitas. He decided, well, I think we need to go to a better place. So they went down a little bit into a little valley, into the area where Fort Sill is today. They drove the spike in the southwest corner of Fort Sill, a place what we call the Old Post Quadrangle. And if you ever go out there, they got a monument there that says this is the first spike that was laid there. All the officers in his unit, 10 officers, guys, decided, I want to be the one to put the spike in. Sheridan said, no, you're not. Private Jones, come over here. And the private was the guy that did it. Hurt a lot of people's feelings, but he was a general, he didn't care. You got any generals in here? Okay. Some of the ladies are generals, you know, you might as well go on and say it. My wife's a general. But anyway, so they drove the spike there, and they named it Fort Wichita. Once they named it Fort Wichita, they went in the mountains, they got sticks. We call them stick houses. They built stick houses for the officers and for the ladies to live in until they could build permanent barracks. Once they got the houses built and got those buildings in, right now there's 2 stick houses still out there on Fort Sill. And they're the originals, and they're still being used today. But the Buffalo Soldiers got busy. They went over on the east side of Post, and they quarried the stone over there. There's a quarry out there, over by Lake George, over in that area. There's a rock quarry. So they took the stone out of there and brought it back into the old post quadrangle. They went up into the Wichita Mountains, cut the wood for the barracks, and they started building those barracks probably about in 1870, 71, 72. They started building barracks out there. And today there's 29 of those barracks are still out on Fort Sill, and they're still being occupied. Basically, we're talking strictly about the 10th Cavalry, because the 9th Cavalry left Texas, left Louisiana, and it went out to Texas, southern Texas, middle part of Texas, out to New Mexico, Arizona, and all the way over into California, establishing forts out that way. But none of them established a fort like Fort Sill. They didn't build buildings like they did at Fort Sill. The soldiers continued to build those buildings until they got finished, and the officers and their wives could move into that building. Matter of fact, one of the houses that's still out there, well, a lot of them still out there, but it's called the Sherman House. And we'll talk about that shortly, about how the name Sherman House got to be. The story is that a lot of people believed that the Buffalo Soldiers came in to fight the Indians. That is not true. They came in to provide a barrier from the Red River down into Texas, because the Lord of the Plains, the Comanche, they would raid from Oklahoma all the way down into southern Texas into Mexico and bring back prisoners. And the Texans were upset about it. They didn't like it, so they wanted some help. And that's why the government set up that force along the Red River of soldiers, and they were the Buffalo Soldiers that did that. Well, you know, they contained as much as they could, but the Comanche, the Kiowa, they'd still go down into Texas raiding and stuff of this nature. Well, after a while, down in Texas, they had General Sherman now came up with his group, and as he was coming up to Fort Sill, there was a wagon train called the Warren Wagon Train. It had been attacked the days after he had come through, and everybody there were killed. The Indians took everything, and they came back to Fort Sill area. I forgot one point. Fort Sill, as I said, it was named Camp Wichita, but Sheridan had a friend named Joshua Seal, and he was a general, and he took that name and transferred it from Camp Wichita into Fort Sill, Oklahoma. So Fort Sill was Fort Joshua Seal, Oklahoma. They just took the Joshua off and just say Fort Sill now. But he was a Union officer, and that's how the name got there. I guess that's why they will never change the name of Fort Sill. You know, they've changed a number of army posts at this time. I don't know why. I mean, history is history, and I don't know why we would want to meddle with history in that sense, but you know how we are. We want to change everything. And so the names of a lot of those posts that we were familiar with, and maybe you served at, they all have new names now. I get them mixed up. I really don't know half of them, but sometimes I can remember them and sometimes I don't. I go back to the old way. You know, Fort Bragg will always be Fort Bragg as far as I'm concerned, but now I think it's Fort Liberty or something of this nature. I'm not sure. Back to the story. The Indians came back to the agency down at over on Lori Tatum Road. Lori Tatum was the Indian agent at the time, and once they came back, they were bragging about everything they did, how they killed and did this, that, and the other. General Sherman at that point was visiting with Benjamin Grierson, and they were sitting out on the porch, and they asked those chiefs to come up to Fort Sill. They needed to talk to them. The plan was, we're going to arrest these guys and ship them off down to Texas. And they did. They arrested them. But one of the chiefs had a pistol hidden, and he pulled it out, and he was trying to shoot General Sherman. But of course that didn't happen, so they captured him, and off they went down to Texas. And that particular chief, I think his name was Big Bird or something of this nature, finally got killed on the way down to Texas. The ones that they took down, they were scheduled to be hanged, but the Quakers came in and talked them out of it, and they were shipped back to the reservation here at Fort Sill. Fort Sill was unique because it never had a wall around it. It is as it is right to this day. And the Indian reservation was surrounding it. Well, every now and then they said that they would run through there screaming and hollering, trying to take coup, I think that's what they called it at the time, you know, tap a guy on the shoulder, show you how brave I am and keep running, that type of thing. During that time period, they just have guards out there. Now, a lot of people know that there's a place called the Old Post Corral, or there's a corral down there at the bottom of the hill. A lot of people come to, oh man, there it is, that's a fort. They were fighting in that fort. No, they were not. That was built by the quartermaster. And that's where you kept your mules and horses, inside of that corral. And they had to do it at night, because if they didn't, they would get stolen. And you know, so they let them out in the day, let them graze, and at night they put them back in that corral, and they put a guard on them there at Fort Sill. The Fort Sill history is beautiful, and there's a lot of things that happen there. If you ever go out there, there's a number of monuments out there that you can read, and it'll tell you who was there, when they were there, and who set up camp there, the whole work. Custer was there for a number of times, and matter of fact, he was there. He played baseball while the Buffalo Soldiers were building the fort out there, the houses and things of this nature. Once they got all the housing built and all the officers had a place, they built the Buffalo Soldier Barracks. And then about 1862, they decided we need a jail, because the jail under the Buffalo Soldier Barracks was full. You know, and it was not full of soldiers. There were a few soldiers in there. There were a few Indians in there, but the majority were bandits, guys that got caught selling whiskey to the Indians, guys that were robbers and things of this nature, because the Buffalo Soldiers were the only law in this part of the state. No other law over here. Bass Reeves didn't come over here. He might have came over once or twice, but if he did, he was just coming over to pick up prisoners. There were a lot of U.S. Marshals that came after Fort Sill, because Fort Sill requested from the judge, the old hanging judge over there in Arkansas, hey, we need you to come over and get these guys and bring them back over there. So they'd send a deputy U.S. Marshal over to Fort Sill, he'd pick them up and take them back over there. And according to what the weather was how long it took him to get them back over to Arkansas, to the at Fort Smith there. The Buffalo Soldiers would be on guard duty all night. Probably be about 24 of them on guard at one particular time, and they'd be in the guardhouse. Normally everybody named that guardhouse Geronimo's house. Well, Geronimo was in there a couple of times. He was a prisoner of war, but he was never a prisoner. And if he got a little too much firewater, they put him in there and let him sleep it off, and in the morning he'd get up and go home. And that's the basis of it all. But everybody said, oh, it's Geronimo's guardhouse, but it was actually just a post guardhouse. Because at night, when the battalion commander left and went to bed, that became post headquarters. That's where the officer of the day was, the sergeant of the guard, all the guards were in there. It was also the dog pound. They kept the old stray dogs over there, because you know, ladies don't want the dogs all in their yard. They planted flowers and there's a dog out there digging it up, so that was part for the doghouse. There's a number of stories. There were wives that would have a beautiful dinner on the table, and they'd sit down to eat, say their prayer, look in the window, maybe 10 or 12 Indians peering in, looking in the window. They have actually had in the little Old Post Chapel, which by the way is the second oldest chapel in the state of Oklahoma. That Post Chapel out there, the Old Post Chapel. That's where they had their weddings. They had dances in there. They had school in there. The chapel was used for many things. You know, they even have the Saturday night party in there. You know, and that's where it was. Benjamin Grierson was a musician, and he actually trained those men that couldn't read or write. He trained them music. They learned how to read music before they learned how to write the English language. And he had a band. Matter of fact, they said it was an outstanding band, because they used it for all their gala affairs and all that stuff out at Fort Sill. Ben Grierson had a few things wrong with his family. He lost a number of children. They passed away. His wife didn't do well. As a matter of fact, grave number 1 and 2, I believe out there is one Buffalo soldier that died and his daughter is buried out in Fort Sill. And those graves, of course, are out there. And I walked the cemetery and looked at all the Buffalo soldier graves, saw some of his kids' graves out there. And it's just a historical thing to know what, was buried there. If you go to Fort Gibson and go to the cemetery there, it was segregated. Can you imagine a segregated graveyard? What difference does it make, But at Fort Gibson, they had black soldiers on one side, white soldiers on another side, this, that, and the other. But at Fort Sill, everybody was buried in the same graveyard. As you know, Chief Knoll is there. There's a number of the Indian chiefs are buried there. All except Geronimo. He has his own special place. And it's out on the East Range. The barracks at were right there. Behind it was the Washer Women's House, and they were women, and the only way they could get in that house out there, they had to have kids, because they needed kids to go down to the creek, Medicine Creek, to bring water up in order to wash the Buffalo Soldiers' uniform. Buffalo Soldier made $13 per month. That's all the money he made. Washerwomen made between $48 and $50 a month. They made more than the soldier. Of course, they had kids and things of this nature. Well, in the beginning, all white women were the washerwomen out there. But some of the officers' wives decided, we're not having that, they got to go. So they were fired, and they brought in black women to be the washerwomen. Well, that caused a problem too, because black soldier, black woman, they got married. And when they got moved, the women went away too. So now they ain't got no washerwomen. So, so they had to go through that angle. Behind the washer was the horse stables. That had over, every soldier had his own horse, over 2,000 horses on that compound. Well, every day, you have to go out and you have to clean the stalls of the horses. Well, once you clean it, you got to pile it up someplace. So they took it, piled it up over there, and when it rained, all the drainage went down into the creek. The creek was used as a water supply. So every day soldiers would go down with barrels on a wagon, they'd fill up the wagon, take it up, and every house got a barrel full of water. Well, people started getting sick, and they didn't know what was going on until they got a young doctor in, and he finally determined that we got to stop doing that, And not only that, they had a problem with mosquitoes, malaria, things of this nature. So one day, they looked up, and there's a stagecoach from rolling in from out of Rush Springs, and a young black man stepped off of that stage. And he was an officer, and everybody goes, "Who is that? Where did he come from?" His name was Henry O. Flipper. His first assignment as an officer was Fort Sill, Oklahoma. He was a cavalry officer. He was the first black man to graduate from West Point. He came in there, he had a degree in engineering. They had tried many ways to drain the swamp up there, as we call it, but they couldn't figure it out. So that was his first detail, was to figure out how to drain that area up there by Mary Songbird Park. Anybody know what, right across from the office club, the wooded area over there? Yeah. And that's where the water stood and all that stuff. This guy went to work and he dug a ditch. And in some places the ditch runs uphill. So they couldn't figure out how to get that water up, but he did. And it ran down and went back into the creek. And that's how they drained it. And actually, right now, it still exists. If you ever played golf and you were going to number 15, your ball probably went in that ditch. I know mine has a number of times. I go, "Wow, Flipper, what's wrong with you?" And so he was there until the late 1800s. And then from there, he went out to Fort Davis. And we all know that once he got out there, he had a little problem. And he was dishonorably discharged from the Army. strange thing about it, though, he continued to work for the Army as an engineer. And of course, when he passed away broke. And in about 1996, 97, something like that, they finally got out there and they got a stone by that particular ditch. But the Buffalo Soldiers moved from Fort Sill in about 1901. They moved out, and the field artillery moved in. Buffalo Soldiers didn't go away, of course. They went down into Texas. They went up to Montana, up in that area, and they were still up there to quell the Native Americans and keep them going straight. You know, Buffalo Soldiers in the Spanish-American War, once the war started in Cuba, they participated in there. They stormed San Juan Hill, Kettle Hill. They were along with Teddy Roosevelt. Once that little skirmish was over, they went into the Philippines to fight the insurrectionists of the Philippines and the Philippine Islands. They stayed down there until that was over. And Colonel Young at that point was a captain. And he was in charge of the 9th Cavalry. And they moved to the Presidio in California. And they became park rangers. Buffalo Soldiers were the first park rangers in the United States. And they stayed there until the beginning, about a little after World War I, and they moved over to back into the East Coast area, Huntsville, Alabama, places of this nature. There were a number of them in the 1910th Horse Cavalry actually was stationed at West Point. They trained horsemanship to the young cadets there. Matter of fact, Eisenhower was one of the men that was trained by the Buffalo Soldiers how to fight aboard horseback, and actually trained them to saber drills and things of this nature. The Buffalo Soldiers had become experts at that, and there was no other units that the Army would send in there to train those young men besides the Buffalo Soldiers. At the beginning of World War II, Buffalo Soldiers did not participate in World War I. They became more of a United States, they stayed in the United States as guards, or whatever you want to call them. They did go into the Mexican-American War and fight with General Pershing, looking for Pancho Villa, which they never caught, of course. They came back from there, and they were in the United States up until that point, until approximately 1944, when their horses were taken away from them. Army said, we're not dealing with horses anymore, we're done with that. And those units were broken down, and they went into other units of all black soldiers. The 461st Armor and the 333 Field Artillery, in places of this nature where they were all black soldiers. Because, you know, in 1948, President Truman desegregated the Army and everybody was segregated, but it took a while before all those units became integrated units. All the way into Korea, there were still some black units that fought in Korea. But after the Korean War, Buffalo Soldier was over. There are still units today. I think the 10th Cavalry is still around someplace. I know they were at Fort Hood for a while, and they still call themselves Buffalo Soldiers. If there are any questions at this time, any questions about the legacy of the Buffalo Soldier? And I just hit up on a little bit. There's a lot more about the Buffalo Soldiers that we can talk about today. But thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
All right, this time we'd like to take the time to honor one of our members of the Southwest Oklahoma chapter of MOA, whose long-term contributions have been significant to the success of this chapter. Today we're going to recognize Leighton Duchman with the National MOA Leadership Award. The award consists of a certificate and a lapel pin. Leighton, would you please come forward?
Well, as most of you know, the MOA national motto is never stop serving. Leighton, an old-time friend, colleague, in so many capacities. I could say this is long overdue. It's long overdue in the recognition, but it's long overdue in us getting him up here as he's tried to do the recognitions this year. But if you don't know, it's one thing. He served in almost as we call it, we move around on the deck chairs on the Titanic among the executive board. Leighton clearly has had multiple chairs, but he managed to get off the boat before the rest of us are still out here waiting for it to go down. But he started out as the secretary, had that for 3 or more years. Then we twisted his arm. We really didn't have to. He was such a professional. Last year we had a hole to fill, and every time it seemed like we had a hole to fill, he was willing to step forward. And that's the kind of guy he is. So then from the secretary, we sent him to the treasurer where we really put his talents to that. We've told you many times, one of the things for those of you who still do file your income taxes where you itemize, any donation you make to our scholarship fund is tax deductible. I can't tell you, other than all the drafts he sent me, how many personal hours, how much stress, strain, and the effort that it took to get that. So if that wasn't enough, we said, well, we now need to separate a scholarship board by our bylaws for tax purposes. So once again, we needed somebody based on secretary experience, treasurer experience. We looked around, and once again, he stepped forward to do that. And that's just some of the highlights in the leadership. But you look around when we go out to recover flags, he and Nancy are there. You pick a project that we've worked on since I've been around this, and the odds are that Leighton was there. So clearly more than deserving of this recognition.
Thank you.
If there's money in there, share it.
All right, at this time, as you know, we do more than support ourselves, with our scholarship money and all that to the junior ROTC cadets, and then also at Cameron, we support a leadership award, and we give certificates and medals to outstanding cadets at Cameron. But we also support other veteran service organizations, and one of those is the Veterans Resource Center. And so today, we'd like to recognize Jervis Jackson, who was the prime force behind getting that resource center started. And at this time, Jervis, if you'll come up. I'd like to present him with a check for $500 from our member.
All right.
All right, who's got the 50-50?
I do.
Okay.